Hello and welcome everyone. This is the third and concluding lecture on Machiavelli, and today we are going to focus in the first part on his another very important text, Discourses on Levy, and his characterization of republics as a better form of government than the principalities. And in the second part of the lecture today we are going to assess the contribution of Machiavelli in the Western tradition of political thought. So, Machiavelli is someone who is subjected to different kind of interpretation as a republic thinker, as someone who wanted a all powerful sovereign ruler to unify, and in pursuit of such unification he should be not concerned about the ethical or the moral concern of the conventional Christian ethics, and also he is someone interpreted as the classical humanist thinker. So, we are going to do that in the second part of the lecture today. And if you recall, in the previous two lectures we have discussed his views on virtue or fortuna, the context in which he was writing, that was the fragmentation of Italy or the all pervasive political and moral decay, and the inability of the Christian ethics or religion to provide stability in that context. So, Machiavelli is someone who is trying to rescue or move away from the dominant Christian ethics or morality and to reassert the classical humanist tradition of belief that human beings through their reason and rationality can create a better society for themselves and for their community. And Machiavelli comes as a first thinker in the medieval or the late medieval era to project a politics which can create the condition for better life for the individual and for the community. In doing that, he remains somewhat uniquely positioned, in the sense he is not clearly modern like Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau, nor he is medieval thinker like Saint Augustine or Thomas Aquinas. So, this we have discussed and also his views on virtue and fortuna in the first lecture. In the second lecture we particularly focused on his text, The Prince, and the advice that he gives to Prince for the creation of a new principalities and how to govern them effectively given the corrupt or the wicked and human nature. So, Machiavelli through his advice to the Prince is trying to develop a theory of politics which helps human being to create a system of government or create a polity in a condition where peoples are imperfect, morally corrupt or violent prone. So, how to create a perfect state in the imperfect condition, and what kind of advice a ruler need to create such perfect order, that is the basis of the Prince. In today's lecture we are going to focus how Machiavelli prefers republics and explain the nature and the characteristic of such republics in his another equally significant, perhaps more significant than the Prince in many political commentators or in the eyes of many political philosophers as well, the Discourse. And in the Discourse he outline the nature and characteristic of the republics, which we are going to focus in the first half of the lecture today, and then we will conclude to assess the contribution of Machiavelli's thought and its different kind of interpretation. Machiavelli as a morally and ethically neutral thinker. So, as we have discussed that Machiavelli on the matters of politics or governing is not taking any ethical or moral position. So, in his assessment of politics or in his advice, he appears to be ethically or morally a neutral thinker. So, with this approach to politics as a ethical and morally neutral observer or a thinker, Machiavelli leaves us with a theory of politics whose sole concern is how to establish a stable polity and how to govern them effectively. So, this is the central concern of Machiavelli political theory, to create or to establish a stable polity given the imperfect nature of human being, constant warfare and the fragmentation of principalities or city in the Italian peninsula. His immediate concern was to have a polity which will unify these fragmented or fragmented polities which are constantly at war with each other in a more stable or united form of rule, and then how to govern them effectively. So, that is the central concern in Machiavelli's political thought, and he provides us a theory of politics which help us to understand how to create a stable order and govern them effectively. And in doing so, there is an ethical or morally neutral stand that Machiavelli takes. So, considering the wickedness and the violent nature of human beings that is combined with the ever changing situation in politics, he wanted the rulers to know the situations as they are rather than as we ought them to be. So, Machiavelli's political thought or political thinking is based on exact or the correct assessment of the situation, not the kind of assessment which we would like to see. So, the ethical and moral concern would be that everybody would behave ideally, morally, ethically in the honest manner, but the given actual condition is not ideal. So, for a ruler to establish a rule, he must be knowledgeable enough or have the knowledge enough through the knowledge of history, by mixing the virtue of fox and lion, to understand the situation as it is rather than as we ought them to be. So, once a ruler understands the situation as they are, then his responsibility is to understand what is the appropriate response to that particular situation. In other words, what is the necessity of that particular situation, and once a ruler fulfill those responsibility and respond to such situations accordingly, then it will bring glory to his rule or to his principalities or the kingdom. So, that is advice that Machiavelli gives to the prince. He discussed two types of government or polity. One is principalities, and the major concern in his text, the prince, is about how to rule principalities, particularly how a new prince can acquire the principalities and govern them effectively. So, in the prince, the subject matter is principalities. And the other form of government or types of government is the republics, and he argued that in the long run, republics or a form of government where citizens play a proactive role in the government through their institution, through their laws and constitution, are more stable than principalities, because in the principalities there will be constant conspiracies, there will be constant traps, enviness among the aristocrats to outperform the ruler, outperform the king or the prince. But in the republics, which is ruled by public institution through the participation of the citizen, the durability or the stability of the polity can be maintained or achieved. So, he argued that republics are more stable than principalities, and he elaborated upon the characteristics and the virtue of the republics in the discourses on Livy, to which we return in a minute. So, discourses is a dense and challenging text to read, but represent the complexities of Machiavelli's political thought. So, if you start reading discourse, it is a very complex text, and in Machiavelli's political theorization also you will not have a kind of systematic or scientific kind of approach to the politics, largely because he combines his knowledge of history or the knowledge of classical Roman republics and its institution, and also the Greek states such as Sparta and Athens, which he uses selectively or appropriate selectively to argue or to use that as a basis for his advice to the ruler or to the prince. So, in the discourse, if you start reading, it is not an easy text to understand. However, it represents the much more complex terrain of political thinking in Machiavelli than it appears in the prince. In fact, for a century, thinkers or the philosophers took discourses more seriously than the prince. And however, the dominant understanding that we have of Machiavelli, that is the thinker of evil or immoral practices in politics, which is based on the prince, is the late 20th century revisit of this text under the new set of ethics in the Victorian England or in France about the moral and ethical behaviors in the polity, and how to govern the polity or the republic on the basis of certain ethical moral norms and so on. So, in those approach, Machiavelli's image of being an thinker of evil or immoral practices is of late development, but much of his thinking and theorization for a very long time was based on these text discourses, which represents the much more complex terrain of his thought and thinking. And I request you all to read this text to arrive at your own conclusion and understanding of Machiavelli and his political thought. So, much of his political thought and its complexities is reflected in the discourses, where he comes out as a humanist and republican thinker. So, this is very contrast to Machiavelli's image in the prince. So, in the prince, he appears to be a defender of principality, that means how a ruler should acquire the principalities or acquire the new territories, and in acquiring such territories, how he should not be guided by the conventional morality or the Christian ethics. There is a kind of sharp resentment or critique in Machiavelli against the Christian ethics or Christian religion, which he associated with the corrupt practices. So, in the prince, he wanted the ruler or the prince to acquire the new territories or new principalities and govern them effectively by combining the virtue of lion and fox, and have the flexibility to respond adequately to the changing or ever changing circumstances in the polity. And that ability or virtue in Machiavellian term brings glory to the prince and also his principalities. So, in the prince, his concern, his focus is on principalities, but in discourses he focuses more on republics. However, we will see in the later part of this lecture that how there is kind of overlapping also. So, Machiavelli in the discourse appears to be a republican thinkers, and this republican and humanist streak of thought in his writings is evident in the prince also, when we focus that how a king should seek friendship with the common people in the long term. So, the role of the common people and protection of their property or family is the concern which is there in the prince also, and it becomes much more evident in the discourses. So, Machiavelli was above all a republican humanist thinker, and it will become much more clearer or much more evident if we read these two texts together, the prince and the discourses. So, our crude caricature of Machiavelli as a thinker of evil will be unsustainable if we try to understand the overlaps that is there between the prince and the discourses in Machiavelli. So, if we study the another text that he wrote called The Art of War, which is the basis of understanding warfare even today, or military preparedness, or the relationship between the citizen and the military, and preparing the citizens' army and so on. So, if we read this text, The Art of War, we have altogether the different notion of Machiavellian thought and polity, which is based on military virtue or military preparedness. So, therefore, Machiavelli's work have been subjected to many and often contradictory interpretation, which is open to again a newer kind of interpretation as well. So, there is no settled debate on correct interpretation of Machiavelli, whether he was a republican or he was a defender of principalities, whether he was someone who totally disregard the role of religion or he want to use it for the political purpose and so on. So, there is a kind of contradictory or ongoing interpretation or engagement with Machiavelli works, and he continued to inspire different traditions of thinking and theorization about the polity, and actually the politicians of different age and different generation continue to derive inspiration from his text, The Prince, and of course, the reading of which is much more complex than the crude caricature in commonsensical understanding of Machiavelli, which we will return to in the second half. If you go to discourses on Levy, where he expressed the views on republics, Machiavelli regarded republics in which every citizen could participate in the pursuit of common goods as a more stable and durable form of government in comparison to principalities. So, in this text, Machiavelli regards the republic as the kind of rule which will ensure the maximum participation from the citizen and their fullest growth, and that will lead to the development of a city both politically and economically from the internal and external threat. So, Machiavelli regarded republics in which every citizen could participate in the pursuit of common good, and here this thing we have to understand, that the politics ultimately is not about the personal good or about the particular good. It should be based on the common good. The corruption or the instability occurs in the polity when it is used for the sake of personal benefit or for the sake of particular interest. So, it will lead to factionalism, it will lead to upheavals or rebellion. So, politics is the pursuit of common good, and a prince, if he can do, it is good. And in fact, in the given condition of Italy, he thought that the strong leader alone can unify the warring city states or fragmented city states, and once such unification is done, a ruler should leave the governing of the city to the republican institution. So, he argued that in this way the durability or the stability of the political order can be maintained when the participation of the citizen and the functioning of the polity is for the pursuit of common good or the public good. It is relevant even today if you look at the politicians and the political practices in different democracies or different government. When the politicians and the parties functions for the public good or the common good and take everybody along in the pursuit of such common good, there is a stability, there is a support for the government, for the party. But when it tries to represent the interest of only one section or the personal interest of the ruler or the party, then there is a kind of protest, demonstration, and it is evident even today in different democracies and different polities. So, for Machiavelli, this understanding of politics as the pursuit of common good is something which we have to keep in mind when he discuss about why republics is the more stable form of government than the principalities, because in the principalities there will be constant enviness, constant conspiracies among the nobles against the ruler or the prince. So, to avoid that, a ruler or the prince, once established the rule, should promote the republican institution or public institution and enable the participation of the citizen, which will ensure the durability and the stability of his kingdom or the polity. So, his support of principalities and the role of prince in creating such principalities or one such rule or polity is regarded by many thinkers and scholars as a kind of transitory thing. So, he wanted this strong ruler like Caesar Borgia or the young ruler of Medici family, Lorenzo. So, his support for the strong ruler or the prince is to acquire or they establish a strong rule and the polity. But that is transitory, which gradually pave the way or which should gradually pave the way for the republican institution with the participation of the citizen to ensure the sustenance and the durability of the rule. So, he regarded that the principalities or a prince should create one polity that is a transitory form of rule which should eventually pave the way for the republican institution and the rule by the people, enabling the citizens participation. So, his preference for the republics again shows Machiavelli's own patriotism and his historical approach to address the challenges of Italy of his time. So, in discourses as well as in the Prince, one of the things that becomes very crucial is his patriotism to unify the Italy and bring back the classical republican glory of the Rome. So, he regarded the Roman classical republican institution as the pinnacle of success or glory for the community. So, the way, in fact, this text discourses on Livy started as a reflection or engagement with the writings of Livy, who wrote about the history of Roman Empire and its republican institution, its citizen army, and the way class interests was balanced in the classical Roman Empire through its republican institution, and how it helps the empire to achieve glory in philosophy, in art, in science, in military warfare, or in its political arrangements. So, that becomes the basis for Machiavelli to address the contemporary challenges that Italian peninsula was facing, where the Catholic Church or papacy have become morally corrupt and politically weak. City states were constantly at warfare, and then in that condition how a strong ruler or prince will unify them, and they will eventually pave the way for republican institution which will ensure the freedom and liberty of the people. And when the freedom and liberty of the people are guaranteed, that will lead to pinnacle of success in the polity. So, in the modern economic thinking which we traced in the writings of Wealth of Nation, Adam Smith. So, he argues that a society will become much more prosperous when citizens are given freedom or the opportunity to choose on their material matters which concerns them. A society which gives maximum liberty for the citizens to choose the life which is most suitable to them will result in the more prosperous society economically and materially. Similarly, in Machiavelli you have this kind of defense of liberty which is necessary for the prosperity of the city states, for its better governing, for its stability from the internal warfare or internal conspiracies and external interference. To do that, the ruler or the republic must ensure that the citizens have the maximum freedom that will bring glory and prosperity to the city states, which will lead to its durability and stability. So, that is the basis of his republican thinking and theorization, which becomes much more clearer and obvious in his writings discourse. So, he argued that the fullest growth of the city or the community, both economically and militarily or politically, is possible in the republics alone, which provides the conditions of personal safety and liberty of all. So, when there is the political instability or political upheavals or rebellions, there are constant threat to life and liberty, and if life and liberty is under threat, nobody would pursue the interest of economic development or how to strengthen the polity. It will create the state of confusion, and that will not ensure the stability of the order. So, the first and foremost thing for Machiavelli was to provide the condition for safety and liberty of the citizens. Now, in the principalities, there is the relative stability or protection of individual life. However, it is constantly at the mercy of the ruler or the prince. The best guarantee of individual life and liberty is possible only in the republican form, with the public institution, laws and constitution, and therefore he argued that the republic form of government alone can ensure the maximum freedom and liberty for the citizen in the long term, and that in turn will ensure the stability of the political rule. So that is a kind of interdependence between the rule and the liberty of the citizens, which is better balanced in the republic than in the principalities or other form of government. So such conditions for freedom for all is not possible in principalities. Only a republican form of government can guarantee the freedom of individual, which is necessary for the stability of the city states and polity. So Machiavelli's preference for republics over principalities is based on his understanding of politics as a domain is always in flux. So this defense of a republican form of government is also based on the assessment of Machiavelli about the politics, which is constantly in flux. There is the ever changing circumstances happening in the politics, and a ruler or the government must respond to such changing circumstances. Now, which form or which kind of rule can respond effectively or in the correct manner? So, if a prince is wise and have the sufficient requisite knowledge and virtue in the political and military matters, he is best suitable to unify. But what happens if the successor or the inheritor of his rule is weak, and his successor again is weaker than the previous one? Now that will create chaos or lead to the conspiracies or enviness or rebellion even. So in the principalities, in the long term, even when the founder of the principality is morally or politically have the sufficient knowledge and virtue to address to the changing circumstances, there is no guarantee his inheritor or the successor would be equally virtuous or equally strong or capable of responding to the changing circumstances. So it is the republic which can constantly innovate itself or change itself to the changing circumstances in the polity, and therefore is most suitable to address to the flux or the challenges or the everlasting or constant changes in the life of polity or the political life, which characterize the polity even today. You find the government or the ruler constantly responding to one challenge after the other, and there is no end of the newer challenges that comes to the ruler's way, and the success or the glory of the ruler is based on how adequately and appropriately they respond to such challenges or such changes constantly occurring in the body politic. And he regarded the republican form with its institution, laws and constitution is more suitable to respond to the changing circumstances than the principalities or a rule by the king. So that is the defense which he gave, and according to Machiavelli, a republic with its institution and class conflicts. We will come to this question of class conflicts and the conflict in the interest of different classes, and how republic form can better govern or manage this conflicting interest in the class that leads to the new innovation and changes for securing the liberty or freedom in a better manner in the republic in a moment. But he regarded that such class conflicts and constant changes that is happening in the politics are best responded within the republican form of government. So let us discuss about what Machiavelli mean by individual freedom or liberty which should be secured in republics for its own stability and for its own safety. So the notion of republic or what kind of freedom and liberty is desirable is very different from our modern libertarian understanding of political freedom or liberty. So Machiavelli, the individual freedom is the freedom to have possessions or property and a family. So, it is very different from John Stuart Mill or Isaiah Berlin or many other conceptions of freedom or liberty for the individual and how it should be guaranteed by the state through the constitution and laws. So, Machiavelli regarded that for the protection of the state or the polity, it is necessary to guarantee certain freedom and liberty to the individual, and this liberty means that individuals should have the freedom to have the possession or the property, and state or the ruler should not usurp those property or those not interfere with the family of the individual. If it does, it will bring rebellions or resentments from the people, which will destabilize or lead to rebellion against the rule or the polity. So, Machiavelli's understanding of individual freedom is the freedom to have property and family, and he wanted the rulers to respect such liberty. So, the resources of the state should be increased not by unnecessarily taxing or extracting resources from the people, but by conquering the new states or expanding the territory of the states. And once the ruler start extracting revenues or usurping the property from the people, it will lead to chaos, it will lead to rebellion. So, Machiavelli advised the ruler even in the republics and also in the principality not to usurp or extract resources from the common people. So, he wanted the rulers to respect this liberty of possession and family of the citizens for the sustenance of their own rule. And in the republics, each class of citizens could take full participation in the economic and the political life of the state if their possessions and families are safe and secured from both internal and external usurpation or appropriation. So, what Machiavelli basically means is that the citizen can participate in the life of polity when their safety of property and family is guaranteed. In the absence of that, they will not take interest or participate in the public life. So, for creating the condition where citizens can proactively participate in the life of the city, both politically and economically, and thereby ensuring its stability, it is necessary for the ruler to secure or guarantee the personal property or the safety of their family life. That motivates the citizen to participate in the public life in the pursuit of common good. In the absence of that, it is impossible to have a citizen which would be driven by the public interest rather than personal interest, and there is kind of this dichotomy between the pursuit of personal interest and the public interest, and the republic and its strength lies when the citizens are driven by the public interest, when the public institution, laws and constitution is in the pursuit of common good, not the personal good or the particular good of any sections in the population. So, Machiavelli thought that the economic and the political life of the state is more secured when the citizens are guaranteed their possessions and families without any appropriation by the internal or the external forces. And this, for Machiavelli, citizens, if their family and property are secured, could be the greatest defender of republic and freedom. And this you can contrast with his apprehension about the role of nobility or the aristocrats or noble birth in the sustenance of republic. Even in the principalities, as I have said, Machiavelli advised the ruler to have friendship with the common people in the long run. So, Machiavelli wanted that the republics can be better secured and defended by the citizens in the long run, not by the nobles or the aristocrats or even by the prince. So, for Machiavelli was aware of the existence of different classes and their conflicting interest in a polity, and this is very strange or unique in Machiavellian political thinking and theorization. So, unlike Marx or even in Plato, where there is a kind of search to remove class conflicts. So, in Plato the idea is to have the harmony of existence, or in Marx there is this idea of revolution which will end the class nature of the society and thereby the rule of polity and the state. So, the idea is to have the communism of life where there is no private property, no need of state, no need of polity, and there will be harmony. Machiavelli is someone who wanted this class conflict to acquire a kind of permanent nature, and the role of republic is to then manage this class conflict rather than eradicate it, rather than remove it. So, Machiavelli acknowledged the existence of different classes and their conflicting interests. So, they have different interests which are not similar, and that is something which should not be extreme, like nobody should be too wealthy or not, or majority of population should be too poor. Of course, that will lead to rebellion or upheavals or political instability. However, the class conflict to a great extent is necessary for the health of the republic, for its own sustenance. And the role of republican institution and the public institution is to manage this class interest or the conflicting interest of the classes. And he again go back to the classical Roman Republic times, where its institution manage those interests perfectly well, and that leads to the glory in the field of arts, politics, poetry, philosophy, military, and so on. So, he regarded that these classes are chiefly divided into two groups, plebeians and the patricians, which are the people or the populace, those are plebeians, and the patricians, which are the nobles or the aristocrats. So, it is the harmony between their interests that sustain the republic. So, according to Machiavelli, classical Roman Empire achieved this harmony through their republican institution, which resulted in its glory and the pinnacles of success in all spheres of individual and collective life, art, culture, poetry, philosophy, and so on, and he wanted that to be re-established or achieved again under the republican form of government. So, he seems to suggest that classes and their conflicting interests are suitable for the durability of a republic. So, he wanted to give them a kind of permanent place, the interests of which could be reconciled through the political institutions, laws, and constitutions. So, he writes that in every republic there are two different dispositions, that of the populace and of the upper class, and all legislation favorable to liberty or securing the liberty is brought about by the classes between them. So, this is the conflicting interest between the plebeians or the patricians, which resulted in the legislation which secured maximum liberty and freedom for the individual, and therefore, he wanted these class conflicts to remain and should be managed for the health of the republics. So, he does not want it to be eradicated. He does not want the harmony of existence as we have seen in the Plato. It is necessary for the health of the republics. So, arts and science of politics, according to Machiavelli, is in reconciling these conflicting class interests, which is not a threat to the republic, instead help in the sustenance of its rule. So, now he argues about a mixed constitution for the health or the strength of republics. So, Machiavelli does not prefer one form of polity over the other, such as monarchy or aristocracy or tyranny or oligarchy or rule by the populace or the rule by the many in the form of democracy. So, he is not taking any moral or ethical position on preferring one form of polity over the others, and he regarded all of them as far from satisfactory in practice. So, each of them for Machiavelli has their specific strengths and weakness, and he wanted the republic therefore to be based on a mixed constitution, that is the combination of the virtue of different forms of polity. So, there can be a ruler, but he alone cannot govern the polity effectively for the long term. So, he want to combine the virtue of the strong leader or the king or prince with that of aristocracy and democracy or the popular rule. So, the republic for Machiavelli is the combination of all these three: a strong leader with a set of aristocrats knowledgeable in governing, and also the participation of the many, the rule of the many. So, Machiavelli writes, the prudent legislator, aware of their defects, that means the defects of all forms of polity, refrain from adopting as such any one of these forms. So, a prudent or wise legislator or ruler will not be guided by any one particular form of polity. So, he chose instead one that shared them all, that means the mixed constitution, and such a government would be stronger and more stable than the one particular form of government. So, he however regarded the role of common citizens in the republic as more important than nobility or even the prince, and that is why Machiavelli's republican notion becomes much more evident. So, he wanted the citizens to have the supreme role or the maximum role in governing the city or sustaining the rule of the republican institution. So, he wanted the citizens to be trained in the political and the military virtue for a republic to survive longer, and for the glory of the republics he wanted the citizens to be sufficiently liberty minded. So, when the citizens are morally corrupt and driven by the personal interest, of course there would be threat to the republics. So, for the citizens to participate proactively in the life of polity, they must be driven by the public interest or the common good. So, he want the citizens to be sufficiently trained in the political and the military virtue, and he also argued about the relationship between the military and the citizen in the text. So, he wanted the citizens to have sufficiently liberty minded with a sense of civic virtue for the sustenance and the strength of republics. This civic virtue is the basis of the republican form of government, which is even based on the classical notion in today's democracy or republics in many countries. So, the role of citizens are of prime importance for the stability or the sustenance of modern democracies and the republics also. So, this civic virtue for Machiavelli is the basis of republican form of government and is very different from the private interests of the citizen. So, it is associated with the common or public good of the whole community, not the personal good or the particular interest of any specific section of the society. So, politics in a republic is thus the pursuit of common good, not the personal good or the private good of the citizens. So, Machiavelli further argues that public good could be better achieved through the institution such as laws and the constitution, and he also wanted to hold the officials accountable and punish them according to the laws and not according to the fancies or whims of the ruler. So, if a public official are punished because of their corrupt practices through the laws and institution, then there will be no threat to the republics as such, because the citizens will believe that there is the official who is corrupt, not the republic. And if the ruler punish a corrupt official not privately but through public institution, then it will prevent factionalism. So, the impersonal kind of rule through institution and punishing those who betray the republican principles or behave corruptly will sustain the republics in the long run. So, the institutions, laws and constitution should be driven by the pursuit of public good, and in the long term when it is driven by public good, sustain the republic and its order. However, these institutions in the absence of civic virtue becomes ineffective and corrupt in the long term, and there is a kind of cyclical notion in Machiavelli as well, where these republics requires the strong ruler to start with, gradually pave the way for public institution or laws and constitution, may ultimately becomes the corrupt, Now, once it becomes the corrupt, then there is again the role of the new leader or the strong leader to reunite the masses under the founding principle or virtue of the republic, that is the common good, not the personal and the private good of the citizens or any factions of it. So, he argued that these institutions and laws in the absence of civic virtue become ineffective and corrupt. They might be also used for the pursuit of personal interest of the rulers or a set of groups or the faction, and it would lead to further corruption in the body politic, which would again require a strong ruler to reunite the people for the pursuit of achieving the foundational values of the republic. This is the cyclical kind of view of history in Machiavellian political thought and thinking. So, now we move to assess his political thought and his contribution in the tradition of Western political thought. The first question that comes when we assess Machiavelli political thought is whether he was a medieval thinker or a modern political thinker. So, the first question to address, we have to understand his unique position in the history of political thought in Western tradition, where he was not entirely a medieval thinker who is rooted in the Christian theology or metaphysics, and nor he was a modern thinker like Hobbes. So, he is somewhat in between or in a phase in history of political thought in Western tradition, where he is moving away from the medieval modes of thinking about the politics, but he is not sufficiently modern in his approach to politics. So, in the Hobbes, as we see that he is regarded as the first modern thinker and not Machiavelli, even when there is a kind of sufficient move away from medieval modes of thinking in Machiavelli. So, although he did explain the distinct sphere of politics and separated it from the clutches of religion, Machiavelli remained rooted in the ideas like fortuna, virtue, and the Christian understanding of the wickedness of human nature, and then explain how to establish the government or effectively rule them through the advice that he gave in the Prince and in the discourses. So, in the Machiavelli you have this tension of positioning him as a medieval thinker or a modern thinker, where he appears to be somewhere away from the medieval, but not yet modern or sufficiently modern like Hobbes. However, many interpreters have also argued Machiavelli as a Renaissance man or a modern classical republican thinker. Another way to assess Machiavelli's political thought is to read these two texts of him, the Prince and the Discourses together. So, although both the texts were written simultaneously, that is, the Prince was written in 1513 and the Discourses in 1513 to 1517. Both these texts were published after his death in 1527. So, Prince was published a year later than the Discourse, that is, Discourse was published in 1531 and the Prince was published in 1532. Now, there is a lot of overlapping between these two texts, and to understand Machiavelli's thought in a proper way, one needs to simultaneously engage with these two texts. Of course, the obvious difference between the two is that in the Prince, he defends principalities or the rule by the one man. In the Discourses, he argues about the republics. So, once you engage with the two texts, you arrive at a conclusion where Discourse appears to be a much mature works of Machiavelli in comparison to Prince, and he favors republics to principality, which could be a better guarantee of freedom and liberty of the citizens, as we have discussed. Although he wanted the republics to be governed by a mixed constitution, the faith and the trust he showed to the common people and their abilities are quite radical for his age, which was rooted in the hierarchical division between the plebeians and the patricians. So, both in the Prince and more explicitly in the Discourses, Machiavelli posed his trust or faith in the abilities of the common man. and this is the kind of humanist tradition where human beings can govern themselves better without relying to philosophical speculation or religious modes of thinking. And that is the virtue of civic life or the civic virtue, and how to govern the polity in a better manner through the participation of citizen, not by one man, not by few men, but by the community coming together. So, in contrast to the dominant understanding of Machiavelli as the theorist of evil, or the murderous Machiavelli as we have in Shakespeare or many of the fiction and non-fiction writings in England or France, it is a very crude caricature or selective, one could argue perhaps incorrect reading of the Prince. Many thinkers regard Machiavelli as a Renaissance man and a Republican theorist of humanist tradition. Spinoza and Rousseau regarded him as the Republican thinker. So, for Spinoza and Rousseau, the Prince is more a kind of satirical text which should not be taken seriously and representative of Machiavelli thought. So, they regarded that the thought that is representative of Machiavelli is the discourse. However, the modern dominant understanding of Machiavelli is based on his text, The Prince, and even that understanding is very selective and crude. Many would argue the incorrect understanding of the Prince. So, the role that he desired a prince to perform in the given context of Italy was to unite the fragmented city states and then gradually pave the way for the growth of republican institution, laws and constitution where the citizens would participate in the governing. That would ensure their liberty and also bring republican glory for the polity, for the republics. So, in the Machiavelli, the politics is not just about acquiring the power. Politics is about the glory, how a prince can achieve the glory or how a citizens can achieve the glory together is something which guides his political thinking and theorizations. So, both in the Prince and in the discourse, he is looking for a politics which could re-establish the past glory of classical republican Rome. So, it would be incorrect to put Machiavelli in a very straitjacket modern caricature or in fact crude caricature of being a theorist of evil or a theorist of immoral actions or murderous actions which is treacherous, dubious and so on, which is based on the non-fiction fictions or the fictions written in Victorian England and also France. Now, Leo Strauss draws our attention when we engage with Machiavelli thought to pay attention to the unambiguous silences in Machiavelli's work, where he never mentions about the soul, God, life after death or the metaphysical questions like what is the essence of being or good lives. So, unlike Plato and Aristotle, he is not bothered about these metaphysical questions or notion of soul, life after death and so on. He appears to take a morally and ethically neutral stand on these matters and concerned solely on redefining the role of politics by securing it from the clutches of religion and ecclesiastical metaphysics. Quentin Skinner interprets Machiavelli as a classical humanist and republican thinker who argued that the liberty or the freedom of the people are best secured in the republics where citizens govern themselves. So, his theory of civic virtue became the basis of republicanism in many modern liberal democracies such as France, US and also in India. The idea that the citizens are the ultimate sovereign or power that a ruler exercises is derived from the people, and people through their election and participation legitimize the rule. So, this idea is based on this civic notion that is there in Machiavelli, which helps in the sustenance or in the legitimacy of the rule and defend the states from political upheavals and instabilities. So, Similarly, many democratic thinkers and scholars particularly appreciate Machiavelli's trust in the common people, which is the connecting thread between the prince and also in the discourses, and they project Machiavelli as the theorist of democracy or rule by the people. There is the feminist criticism of Machiavelli for his misogynist writings, and these feminists criticize Machiavelli's distinction between private and the public life and confining women to the household or the private lives alone. So, in the Machiavelli, if you read his focus on political and military virtue, according to the feminist scholars, is inherently masculine and therefore confine the roles of women in the public life. So, there is the plausible valid criticism against Machiavelli about his conception of politics, which is inherently masculine, which is about the strength, which is about the boldness or ruthlessness of the lion or a male who can bring glory, and there is little or no role for the women except in the private lives or in the life of the family. Now, many other feminists have given the contrary interpretation of this by arguing that the Machiavellian politics is open equally to both male and female, and he does not really discriminate between the male and the female. Similarly, political writings of Machiavelli has also inspired Antonio Gramsci and many post Marxist scholars, particularly Louis Althusser and many others, who argued that the prince should be written in a radically different way today, where the prince is not about the one ruler as such, but for the common people, and that radical interpretation of prince will allow the citizens or the community to have a more stable or equitable rule or governing, which would represent the interest of all the sections, not just the few or those who are wealthy or property. Now, of course, this one could question, but then there is the kind of Marxist engagement with Machiavellian thought as well. So, as we have said that the Machiavellian political thinking and theorization has been subjected to different kind of interpretation, from the classical humanist Republican tradition to the feminist to the Marxist to the Democrats and so on. Now, to conclude, Machiavelli wanted the future prince of the Florence to unify Italy and to re-establish the past glory of Roman Empire. So, that is the immediate concern of Machiavelli's political thought and theorization. However, in doing so, he wanted the prince to do away with the Christian ideas on justice and morality, and politics must be based on the realistic and the pragmatic assessment of circumstances, guided by the knowledge of history, rather than on any transcendental notion of ethics or morality. So, the politics for Machiavelli is about realistic or the pragmatic assessment of the circumstances, even intuitive or unreflective understanding of these circumstances, and then respond to them accordingly. That is political virtue or military virtue in true sense of the term in Machiavellian thinking, which is ethically and morally neutral. It is not driven by transcendental idea of justice or morality and ethics and so on. So, the prince should, according to Machiavelli, must be flexible enough to adapt to the ever changing circumstances in the politics, and that is the adaptability which is necessary for success in the ever changing moments or the circumstances in politics. And there is a mixed legacy of Machiavelli's thought. So, all the treacherous, deceptive and the ruthless manipulation in actual politics is often associated with him, and that is the dominant understanding of Machiavelli. So, every harmful or unethical activity in politics is seen as Machiavellian politics, which is very crude and perhaps incorrect understanding of Machiavelli's thought. And international diplomacy even today is inspired by the Machiavellian politics. So, his advice to the prince has become the basis for many generations of politicians and statesmen to outwit their opponents. So, however, he was a Republican thinker who was the first to rescue politics from the clutches of religion and argued for the role of citizens in the governing the polity. And this is very radical for his age, where the hierarchy is considered as natural or just, and the status of the individual is based on his birth, whether plebeian or the patrician, the noble or the people. Given that modes of thinking, Machiavelli arguing or posing his trust in the common people and their abilities in the sustenance of rule is quite radical. So, that shows the Machiavellian thought as the representative of the classical humanist tradition, rather than the crude caricaturing of the Machiavellian politics as treacherous, dubious. So, he is not arguing for immoral action for the sake of it, and this often used cliche that ends justify the means, but that ends is always the public good or the common good, that is the political stability, and in pursuit of that common good all kind of actions are permitted or permissible, but not for the personal good or for the personal self aggrandizing interest, as we have seen in his explanation in many of the fictional and non-fictional writings in Victorian England and also in many contemporary writings. So, Machiavelli, having the cyclical view of history, wanted the unification of Italy under a strong ruler. However, its durability, he argued, was possible only under a republic form of government. However, the republics would eventually lead to moral decay, corruption and factionalism, which would again require one strong leader to reunite the public under the foundational virtue of a republic. So, there is a kind of constant change which is cyclical in history. So, there is the fragmentation which requires the strong leader to unite, but that leader alone could not sustain the rule for the long term. Therefore, he should give way for the civic republican institutions, laws and constitution, but these civic participation will ultimately lead to corruption in the body politic, which would again lead to fragmentation, factionalism, which again requires the stronger. So, there is a kind of cyclical move in the history that is there in the Machiavellian political thought. So, Machiavelli's works therefore over the last 100 years have been interpreted and reinterpreted in so many ways. So, you have Machiavelli as a theorist of evil or immoral action, as a humanist republican thinker, as a democrat, or as a radical or revolutionary thinkers, as in the Marxist interpretation of Machiavelli as well. So, Machiavelli's political thought is open to different kind of interpretation, and you are welcome to arrive at your own understanding of Machiavelli political thought and thinking, besides what we have done in these 3 lectures on Machiavelli thought, that you can do by engaging with Machiavelli's writings, particularly his Prince and Discourses, and then you are open to have your own understanding and interpretation of Machiavelli beyond the crude caricature of Machiavelli as the theorist of evil, or someone who justified all kind of means in the pursuit of politics. So, there is a kind of very complex argumentation that is there, which I hope you will understand once you engage with his own writings. So, on Machiavelli, whatever we have discussed, you can refer to some of these books, which is part of the other lectures as well, like David Butcher and Paul Kelly, Political Thinkers from Socrates to Present, Gary Browning, particularly the engagement with the Skinners and his arguments is there in A History of Modern Political Thought. Murray Forsyth and Cephalagia remains the key text to understand many of the thinkers, including Machiavelli. I will request you to read these 2 texts, Niccolo Machiavelli, The Prince and the Discourses on Livy. The Prince is edited and translated by Peter Vandanilla, and the Discourses is translated and edited by Julia Conaway Vandanilla and Peter Vandanilla. Both these books are part of Oxford Classics, published by Oxford University Press. The other texts are James Allen Wren on Politics, and the Quentin Skinner Machiavelli, a very short introduction you should refer to, and also Sheldon Wallen, Politics and Vision, continuity and innovation in Western political thought. So, these are some of the texts which you should refer to understand more about Machiavelli's thought and his contribution in history of Western political thought. So, that is all in this lecture today. Do share your thoughts and comments. We will be happy to respond and learn from those. Thank you all.